Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2021 GCA Forum. This meeting is being recorded and will be recorded and retained for the legally approved retention period and will be subject to release under the State Public Records Act or the Freedom of Information Act. Will be published publicly on our GCA YouTube channel. And these slide decks and recordings for this and past forums are linked to on our GCA Forum webpage. I'm Susan Wilbanks, and myself and my fellow grant analysts will be presenting on topics that we have prepared material for the entire hour. Please do ask us questions using the chat feature in Zoom. We will take some time at the end of each segment to answer them. And do ask us questions. We want you to be engaged. This meeting is for you. We have several items on our agenda, going more or less in the order of how an award processes through GCA throughout its lifetime. And we will be starting with our newest GA, Patrick, who will be talking about the OSP to GCA transition.
All right, thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. My name's Patrick, and as Susan mentioned, I am the newest GA. I'll be kicking us off with the OSP to budget setup process and explaining how we take what's given on an item and input it into the financial system. Next slide, please. So there are two main items we receive from OSP. The first is a post-award change, or a PAC. This is for any items that are not adding new funds. They're making changes to existing awards, whether that be payment terms, the period, like an extension is a common one, or updating the F&A rate. And then our other item is a funding action. These are commonly new or renewal awards, but can also be supplements and supplement extensions. These are any action that add new money to an existing or create a new award, new money. Next slide, please. So these all start through in the department. They'll create an EGC1 for the proposal and submit them to OSP. Once OSP receives it, they'll work with the sponsor to create a fully executed award, which creates a funding action that then gets routed to us in GCA. The information input into the EGC1 is pulled in. This includes the PI, the location, box number, org code, etc. So that information being correct helps us to get the correct info into the accounting system. And then once that's been completed by OSP, it's sent down to our office and will be pulled into our budget setup team's workload for the next day. Next slide, please. The first thing our budget setup team will do is they'll open the FA and go into the award documents. We are using these to find and verify all of the information on the FA, as well as anything that we input into the system, including billing terms, financial reporting terms, the PI on the award period, any budget breakdown provided by the sponsor, and anything that we would need to know in order to help manage this award in the future. Next slide, please. Once we've verified that, we will go ahead and translate it into the codes for FIN, our financial system, before Workday kicks off in a couple years. This information takes a couple days to flow through to MyFD and Grant Tracker, so it will not be updated immediately, but once that notification for a PAC or FA is sent, that's when we've input the information. Next slide, please. Once we've set up the budget in the financial system, we'll then input it into our billing system. There are three main types of awards that we'll bill on. Those are cost reimbursables, schedule pays, and milestones, which we'll go over in a segment later today, when we really get into the invoicing. Then there are a couple of non-invoiced awards that we are not inputting into our billing system, and that's our letter of credits and pay in advance. There are two different types of awards associated with what we call pay in advance, and that's the form of payments 07s, which are what I call kind of a true pay in advance. It's where the sponsor has provided us all of the funds up front and we already have the full check. And then there's form of payments 11s, which are also called pay in advance, but it's where the department handles the billings. And these are most often associated with clinical trials where it's billed on a per patient basis, since we don't have that information in GCA. So that would be how we set those up. Next slide. And at this time, if there are any questions, go ahead and feel free to pop them in the chat.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, in that case, we will go ahead and move forward to our next topic, which is Invoicing 101. So as we were just discussing, we have three standard invoice types: scheduled payment, milestone, and cost reimbursable. And cost reimbursable is further broken down into interim versus final or special handling. GCA uses a separate software system or program for invoicing that's it's not the same as Grant Tracker and MyFD. But it's important to note with cost reimbursable awards, we are pulling data from MyFD. It is the same transactions that are posted. We will sometimes get people contacting us asking, well, I saw this invoice went out, but why wasn't this particular charge invoiced? And the answer is almost always going to be that the charge is not on the budget during the billing period. It might be that it was posted to the wrong budget, in which case it needs to be transferred, or it may be that it has not yet posted in the period that we invoice, which is often the case with something with a sort of a travel or a pro card reimbursement, that it kind of lags behind the activity. And so these are entered in our billing system as cost reimbursable. And scheduled payment and milestones, we enter those schedules as part of budget setup, as we were just discussing. And one important note is we do not invoice if a budget is in advance or temporary extension status. This is because in that case, that means that we don't have a fully executed agreement that's been processed on a funding action for that period. So we don't have the legal authorization really to invoice those charges until the budget is no longer an advance or temporary extension. Scheduled payment is the least common of these invoice types, but it's the most simple in many ways because it's a case where the sponsor has a clear schedule of payments in the award. They might be paying monthly, quarterly, annually, and they're going to pay on that schedule. They don't require any further reporting or transaction breakdown or deliverables to do that. These invoices are going to be automatically generated twice a month, beginning and mid-month. And all payments scheduled for that month that are already in our system on the first day of the month will be picked up in that batch. So if you have a payment that's scheduled for August 30th, it'll get picked up in the August 1st batch. So the reason we have that second batch is if anything is missed, due to perhaps a setup error, or if we've just gotten a new award set up that requires an upfront scheduled payment, those will be picked up in the mid-month batch. And these invoices are automatically emailed or mailed to the sponsor, or they might be internal. That's the case if the sponsor doesn't require an invoice and we just need to set up an internal invoice in order to receive and post the payments as they come in. So the next type is milestone. And milestone invoices are contingent on deliverables or progress being made on the project. And this is usually broken down in the award agreement. It will have a list of deliverables, and those will usually each have a dollar amount associated with them. Though in some cases they're reduced as billed, which may be that the payment schedule is less clear, or if it's a case where it's billed at some kind of per unit rate. It might be that sort of for each sample or for each person contacted for a study that you would have a certain dollar amount. And so we're invoicing based on the amount of samples processed rather than sort of a lump sum for an individual deliverable. And the most important thing to note about milestone invoices is they are not automatically generated. We need you to notify us when these deliverables are ready to be invoiced. We don't know when these deliverables are completed unless you tell us. We do run a report of unbilled milestones based on this sort of schedule that we think the milestones should be met, which is usually outlined in the award agreement. And we will follow up and communicate with you, but we really urge you to just communicate with us as soon as these deliverables are completed. And if you get a notice from us, please update us on the status. And as with the scheduled payment, the invoices are either emailed, mailed, or internal. In some cases, they require special handling to submit. It could be that there's a specific sponsor format or a sponsor portal that we have to go through. Or in some cases, the invoices require backup that we can't provide. And in that case, we ask that the department provide the backup and attach it to the invoice to submit. Cost reimbursable. This is our most common invoicing type. It's based on actual expenditures. We wait for the prior month to close before we can issue invoices. And in straightforward cases where there's no special handling required, the sponsor will accept our automatically generated invoices, and we don't have to provide any extra backup. These are generated automatically 3 times a month. This starts after the prior month closes, so it's why you typically see invoices going out on or around the 10th of the month, and then at approximately 10-day intervals following. These are automatically emailed or mailed to the sponsor, depending on the contact information we have. And in cases where a budget has special invoicing requirements, we generate these invoices automatically once a month at mid-month, and then prepare whatever's needed to meet those special requirements. It could be placing the information in a sponsor format, submitting it online through a portal, reaching out to the department for any backup needed, or just any other special submission requirements that are needed. And final invoices. These are issued for cost reimbursable budgets, can either be a final billing or a $0 final invoice. This typically involves the charges that are posted to the budget that were incurred during the award period, but that post to the financial system after the budget end date. They require some extra analysis from GCA to make sure the budget's ready for final invoicing. We automatically generate these twice a month after the final action date is passed. It's a longer process than issuing the interims. And in some cases, we have to remove a budget from the automatic batch and generate its invoice manually. This is usually the case if there's a pending supplement extension, if there's pending transactions, or sometimes other issues. And unlike interim invoices, these aren't going to show a specific billing period. We bill through the date the invoice is generated, and the billing period is listed as final. Just some additional information. When invoices are generated, they will be visible in Grant Tracker the next day. And if the invoices we're sending out are sponsor format or go through a sponsor portal, what's being shown in Grant Tracker may not match what was submitted to the sponsor. And in that case, you should receive a Grant Tracker note with a copy of what we submitted for your reference. And it's important to kind of keep this in mind, because sometimes the sponsor will come back and say, oh, I don't seem to have your September invoice. Can you resend? And you want to make sure that you send what they actually got. It can create confusion if they get a specific format and we send them the sort of automatic version that's in Grant Tracker. Another challenge we have sometimes is cases where a sponsor wants us to bill a sub-budget separate from the parent. If the sponsor tells you that, or if they say, oh, for this new supplement, we need separate invoices for this, or, you need to bill this portion separately, as soon as you hear that, let us know right away, because it's much cleaner if we know that as soon as the sub budget is set up. We don't have to go back and void invoices and shuffle transactions within our system. So it's one area where we really ask you to keep us informed. And some best practices for departments. Know the award type for the awards invoice type and whether there are any special requirements. It's kind of a subset of what we ask for anything to do with budgets. Pay attention to your award agreement, know your award. If you get a grant tracker note from us, please review it. And if it's asking you for any information or response, please respond promptly. If the department is responsible for submitting invoices for a particular award, submit those invoices as soon as you can. And if it's a milestone budget, notify GCA as soon as that deliverable is completed so we can issue a timely invoice. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we actually do have a number of questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to do these a little bit out of order. So the first question, what software does GCA use for invoicing?
It's a program called JDE Edwards, or JD Edwards.
Okay. Next question, how standard is it for departments to bill separately versus GCA?
The only cases where a sponsor should be issuing invoices without input from GCA would be a clinical trial budget, which is kind of a separate matter from the types that we are discussing here today. If you do have questions about clinical trials, we can discuss those later, or you can contact us via email, gcahelp@uw.edu. For the others, if it's either GCA is issuing the invoices directly, or we might need some information from you to complete our invoices, or there may be backup that the department needs to include with the invoice, but we're still preparing it. And we will communicate with you when that's required. So you should know if you need to provide input or to be the one to submit the invoice after we prepare it.
Okay, next question. It's sort of a budget setup question too. Could you explain why a budget amount is put into MyFD when it's milestone-based payments, but no budget entered when it's participant enrollment-based payments, even though we have an anticipated enrollment target and total budget amount on the application and award document?
Okay, that is something that I think my colleagues, if I'm, definitely step in and tell me if I'm not giving the sort of full correct information here. But even when we have kind of an expected amount on those participant type budgets, it's less defined. I mean, you might say you're expecting 50 patients, but we don't know for sure. It might be 45, it might be 55. So we're going to increase that as we actually receive those payments as the activity occurs. Whereas with milestones, the expectation that is that if you do complete what you agreed to, you will receive that full payment amount. Does that, asking my colleagues here, am I getting that right?
Yeah, there's a limitation in the system as well where we can't input a budget for those FOP 11s. We have a flag called auto budget, and that's what drives the award and revenue then as we receive payments. And when that flag is on, we actually cannot input those budgets anyway into the budget driver.
Thank you. Any other questions, Michelle?
Yeah, so there are a few more. Okay, so is it expected with milestone invoices that the PI communicates with the sponsor on the requirements and not GCA?
That is going to, it's usually a little bit of both. I mean, it is something that's going to vary depending on what the deliverables are and what's set up in the award agreement. But it's often the case where the milestone is something to do with the PI prepares a report and submits it to the sponsor. And once it's been submitted, or in some cases, once it's been approved, then GCA can invoice. So what I would say is when a deliverable has been completed to the sponsor's satisfaction as defined in the award agreement and in your interactions with the sponsor, then you can notify GCA to issue the invoice.
And then next question for milestone contracts, at what point would GCA ask that the department bill the sponsor directly? Is there a certain level of complexity that GCA would not be able to accommodate?
Usually with milestone or with anything else, it's a case where the sponsor is asking for information to accompany an invoice that GCA doesn't have access to. That might be, just having an activity report. There's some cases where they want the report and the invoice together, as opposed to you send the report and then they'll accept an invoice. Or in some cases, they're asking for some level of backup, whether it's receipts or timesheets to prove activity. That's when we're asking for department help. It's not so much complexity as who has what information.
And then next question, does GCA typically invoice for revenue accounts, the 07 prefix budget numbers?
We do not.
Okay. And then the last one, I'm not sure if it's actually a question, but one challenge we have is when we have an advanced budget in place for a project over 1 month in the future, where the advanced budget is placed instead as to an invoicing is turned off. And we have a student tuition charge, which is paid proportionately across the quarter. Only a portion of the tuition is paid on the current budget, and the remainder is not charged on the advanced budget, which starts mid-quarter.
Well, as if the advanced budget is in place, does it, and this may be a case where this might be something I have to research with a little more detail later. It seems to me that if the advanced budget exists, we would probably be able to charge the tuition to it and then invoice it once it's out of advanced status. But yeah, for this specific question, it may be a case where you need to follow up with us via email or grant tracker, or talk to us after this meeting. Anything else?
All right, no further questions.
Okay. In that case, I will hand it to Michelle for tracking award payments.
Yeah, so next I'm going to go over award payments and where you can see how much has been paid against your award budget and what to do in the case of missing or mystery payments. Next slide. So payments that are received are viewable in Grant Tracker. You're not going to see payments in MyFD for most award types, with the exception of the form of payment 11 budgets, which were discussed previously. And in Grant Tracker, there's a few sections where you can see these payments. The first section would be the financial information section. I have a screenshot here. It's basically a summary of your award budget. So if you look in the far right, there's a column called receipts, and this would show you the cumulative receipts to date. Next slide. And if you're looking for a more comprehensive overview of your payments, you would look in the receipts section. So this would list out the individual payment amounts and has details such as when they came in, how much it was for, and which invoice it was against. And then the next section, or next slide. If you're looking to see how much was paid and hasn't been paid for each invoice, you would look in the invoices section. And here you could see how much each invoice was for and how much remains to be paid by referring to that column labeled open amount. So if the open amount says 0, it means that the invoice has been paid in full, whereas if it has any other amount, it means it's been either partially paid or unpaid. Next slide. So let's say you have a number of unpaid invoices or payments aren't coming in as expected. What happens next? So there are a few factors that we look at when the invoice is due and then who handled the invoice submission. So if it's invoices that GCA submits directly to the sponsor, our agent or receivables team will follow up with the sponsor following the due date, and they'll continue following up like about every 30 days and a bit more frequently until they receive a response regarding payment, such as when it's going to come in, or they receive feedback regarding the invoice, like it needs to be corrected before payment can be issued. And if further action is needed on the invoices, we'll either work directly with the sponsor if it's something like just adding a PO to the invoice, or we'll loop you in if we need something from the department. And if it's a case where the invoices are submitted by the department, our invoicing team has been sending notifications via the grant tracker if they notice that there are multiple unpaid invoices, and they're just checking to see that the invoices are being submitted and if anything else is needed from GCA to ensure that these get paid. Next slide. And now for locating payments. So although it seems that there are a lot of missing payments, there are cases that we have actually received the payments, just that we haven't identified them yet. So we receive a fair number of payments that don't include clearly identifying information, such as the budget number or invoice reference. And it becomes a little bit complicated when we receive these lump sum payments for multiple invoices, but then it's not clarified which invoices they're for. So for these, it takes a little bit more time to determine where they should go. And so you might not see them apply to the budget right away. And of course, if the sponsor confirms that they sent payment, we'll work with them to determine when it was sent, how it was sent, was it ACH or check? So then we can locate it and apply it to the budget. Next slide, please. So locating ACH and wire payments. So if the sponsor tells you that payments were issued via ACH or wire, one thing you can do is to review the ACH wire list issued by banking and accounting. They have two lists. So the first one is the total incoming ACH wire list. This is updated for every business day. And then they also have the unclaimed ACH wire list, which is updated about every month or so. So if you happen to review these and then you see a payment that seems to be intended for your budget, let us know. And in the case that it's on the unclaimed ACH wire list, also email banking and accounting at bankrec@uw to obtain a sequence number so it can be applied to your budget. Next slide, please. And then mystery payments. So these are payments that may or may not belong to you. So if you're looking at your budget and the total receipts look off or don't tie it out to your records, please let us know. We've had situations where payments were misapplied due to budget number mix-ups, or there was a case recently where a sponsor wasn't sure if they had paid an invoice, but then on our end, we did show that the invoice was paid. So we had to look into that a little bit further. So if you see something that you're not sure of and you want to know more about, let us know, and then we can look at it together. Next slide. And then finally, getting payments to the right place. So just to ensure that payments are properly applied and don't get lost, we encourage sponsors and also you, if you're sending over checks, to include a budget number reference or invoice reference so then we know what it's for. And if you're sending over check payments, we request that they be sent to our lockbox address, which is in Chicago, because the check processing is a bit more streamlined than sending it to GCA's box number through campus mail, just because it goes through a few more hands when it's then sent to our box number. The next slide. And then finally, I just listed a few links to those ACH wire lists, which I referenced earlier. The first one's if you want to subscribe to that total incoming ACH wire list, and the second one is a link to the unclaimed deposits. Any questions? I see no questions.
All right. Good morning or mid-morning. This is Azalea, and I will be presenting on how you can go about obtaining copies of journal vouchers, CTIs, and ISDs for your files. For those of you who attend our forum regularly, you may remember the presentation from last year, but with so many new folks joining the UW research community over the last year, we have noticed an uptick in requests for documents from a lot of new people out on campus. So we thought it'd probably be a good idea to redo this presentation. But just to let you know, I did update it, so it's not going to be this exact same one as last year. All right, next slide, please. When you perform your monthly reconciliation of your budgets in MyFD, you will notice a variety of charges posted to your award. You will see payroll charges, which come from the workday distributions entered by your coordinator. There will be ProCard charges and purchase orders from Ariba for outside goods and services. And you will see charges for internal services from central self-sustaining entities like housing and food for catering and creative communications for printing services and CRBB for your clinical trial needs. And among all those goods and services charges, you will also see journal vouchers. Journal vouchers are an internal transaction and are used to process accounting entries. They are primarily used for funds transfers and corrections. Many central offices process JVs. Some routine JVs that you may encounter are often tuition JVs from student fiscal services, rent allocations from real estate, and indirect cost JVs from GCA. You, in fact, also process a journal voucher anytime you do a transfer in MyFD from one budget to another if it's posted on the wrong one. Next slide. During your monthly budget reconciliation, you spot a mystery JV. And you have some questions about it and some concerns, but before you contact GCA Help asking for a copy of that JV and what it was for, please remember that many central offices process JVs, not just GCA. There are up to 25 different central offices and divisions at the UW that submit journal vouchers on a daily basis. And just to clear up any misconceptions you may have, GCA does not store copies or have access to the JVs of the other 24 central offices and divisions. You will need to follow up with those offices directly. So to determine which office to contact about a JV, you want to visit the financial reporting journal voucher webpage to find the correct office to contact. This slide includes a link to that webpage. So once we post a copy of the slide deck to our website, you can click the link here and get to that page. I highly suggest bookmarking the page for quick access to it in the future. And also this screenshot is a bit deceiving because the page itself is extremely robust. It's actually a very nice long page. It's got plenty of great information about the journal vouchers and all the 25 different departments that you can contact depending on the numbering of the journal voucher. All right, next slide. If you know what the journal voucher is for, and you don't really need to contact any departments, you don't have any questions, but you want a copy of it for your budget file, you can quickly obtain a copy by using the journal voucher detail report in the BI portal. There is really no need to contact GCA Help to get a copy of a JV. So several years ago, we switched to electronic uploads of the journal vouchers using FastTrans. This is a paperless process. So when we became fully automated, we decommissioned the practice of sending out paper copies of the JVs to campus. This is why UW-IT created the journal voucher detail report. On this slide, I have a screenshot of the report page so you know what it looks like if you've never seen it before. And I have also provided a link directly to the report so you can check it out if you are unfamiliar with it. Next slide. So if it is your first time using this report, I highly recommend reading through the interpretation guide before running the report. It has some great tips and tricks as well as some examples to help you get the most out of the tool. Just look for the tab labeled interpretations on the report page. And so this is a screenshot of that. And you'll see there's a blue button that says run report, and then there's a bunch of tabs there. You can click on each tab to kind of check out what they're all about, but the interpretation tab is where it's at. And again, very small screenshot, extremely robust page, and UWIT just did a really great job on this report. All right, next slide. Once you click that blue button that I mentioned earlier, labeled Run Report, you will see this screen next. Just fill in your search parameters and then click that View button on the right-hand side to get a copy of the JV. Next slide. So in this example, here's a very common JV that GCA posts all the time. And we actually get a lot of questions about this. Basically, it is a JV that is setting up a renewal budget. The new ones also kind of look like this as well, but they have a different description. So as you can see, this JV is only showing the revenue entry or credit side of the JV transaction. You're not seeing both the debit and credit. The debit portion is going to be a general ledger account. And as a rule, that information is not shown on any campus copy, so nobody tries to use that account. So don't be concerned when you're trying to pull up a copy of that JV and it's only one-sided. Again, most likely the other side is a general ledger account that will not be shown to campus. Next slide. And another common JV that GCA processes for campus all the time are deficit transfers. So in this example, you do see both the debit and credit sides. That way you can review to see how the JV was processed and what budgets were involved, and if it was done correctly. All right, next slide. So that's going to be mostly for a lot of electronic JVs that were processed using FastTrans. The other way that journal vouchers can be processed is in My Financial Desktop. By the way, if you don't know, the system unfortunately is currently down if you have tried to use this in the last day or two. So in 2018, the folks at My Financial Desktop introduced the ability to process journal vouchers in MyFD. This allowed departments around campus the ability to process JVs without the need of a FastTrans account. GCA uses this functionality when we process indirect cost adjustments associated with subcontract invoices. The reason why we did this is to make the JV and backup documents more accessible to the department staff who may not use Grant Tracker or receive the Grant Tracker notifications when an adjustment is processed. So in this example, you would notice that the description says indirect cost adjust. So if you click that link, next slide, you'll be taken to this page, which is the transaction details screen. So look for that really small dark purple button at the top of the page that says show my FD JV. And then click that to get to your journal voucher. Next slide. All right. So here's a screenshot of the top portion of the JV, which contains a detailed description and some processor information. So you'll see, again, came from GCA. It's for indirect cost adjustment. And then you'll see maybe some familiar names that you've run into in Grant Tracker when we've answered your inquiry. So this is just the top portion. Again, you're going to scroll down on this page. Next slide. And when you do scroll down, you'll be able to see the debits and credit side of the transaction. If you click the button that says view attachment, that green one right there, a PDF copy of the indirect cost reconciliation will pop up and you can download those for your files. So those are the attachments that we formally used to attach in Grant Tracker for you. So now everyone has access in your whole department if they need it to review or to just make sure that we had done the adjustment correctly. All right, next slide. And then alternatively, if the second reference field also contains a link, it will also take you to the transaction detail page. And that pretty much sums up my presentation on journal vouchers. Next slide. Now let's go back to some ISDs and CTIs. If you are new to the UW, there are two ways internal goods and services are charged to other budgets. So internal sales documents, or ISD for short, are used to record a sale by an auxiliary enterprise. So again, this is going to be used by Housing and Food or Creative Communications. A cost transfer invoice, or CTI for short, is transferring costs and services between budgets at the UW. A classic example of CTI use are on a grant are program income budgets. If any of you guys have any of those that you manage. One big point of concern for someone when they're trying to reconcile a budget is access to internal invoices and external charges. You're trying to make sure that the charges make sense and are what you expected. For external charges, that's usually a little bit easier because the invoices tend to be readily available. For example, if someone in your department orders something online, they can just email you that receipt. Or if a consultant or contractor submits an invoice directly to you for payment in Ariba, at least you have those documents handy. However, it can be challenging to receive an internal invoice if you are not on the distribution list for ISDs or CTI copies. Next slide. So just to let you know, GCA will never issue an ISD or CTI to your budget, just a JV. So we are not the best office to contact when you're trying to get a copy of an invoice or if you're trying to find out what a charge is for, because honestly, we really don't know. When researching which office to contact, use the information in the reference fields in MyFD to look for a phone number or an email address to contact. And if no contact info is provided, your best bet is to use the originating area code. And I'll go into that in just a second. But in this example, as you can see, there's a variety of ISDs and CTIs charged to this budget. And for some departments, they will put a contact information in there. So again, if you think that it's not a charge that you had asked for, or you don't know what it is, and you want to get a copy of the invoice or who had asked for this charge, you can go ahead and call that phone number or you can send an email. But then for the other ones, for the other ISDs, there's nothing for you to use to find out who a contact's for. So that's where the originating area code comes in handy. All right, next slide. So what is an originating area code? It's an identity code used in FastTrans to track where the transaction is coming from. And any charge in MyFD, whether it be expenditure or revenue, any transaction is gonna have this originating area code. So in order to find out what that code is in MyFD, you start by clicking that transaction description first. So in this example, I'm going to click that SLU shared equipment CC. All right, next slide. And then that's going to take you again to the transaction detail page, a very helpful page. So what you want to do is you want to scroll about that page and look for the general fields. And then scroll down to look for that originating area code. And so in this example, the code is LU. And then we're going to click the words originating area code because that is also a link. All right, next slide. So next, after that, you're going to be taken to this My FD glossary list of all the originating area codes of the UW. So to continue with my example, I looked for LU and the contact is Matthew Curry. Maybe not so helpful because you don't see an email or a phone number, but please note Matthew Curry does not work for GCA. So unfortunately, you're gonna have to look him up in the UW directory to find out what his email and phone number is to contact him. All right, next slide, please. And that is my presentation. Let's move on to some questions, please.
So the first one, the comment on ISDs and CTIs says ISDs and CTIs do not usually include any information about requesting the service or approving the expense. This can make the reconciliation challenging.
Oh, I agree. Let's see, Helen. Yeah, that is true. That can be really frustrating. And sometimes I do wonder if it's a limitation of our systems. Again, as you all know, our systems are super old. They didn't account for all the information. Again, they relied heavily on paper documentation back in the day, and sending those out to campus. And so right now we're kind of just in this limbo time where we need all this great information and we have to go hunting for like area codes and trying to guess and find this information. So it is extremely frustrating and hoping that Workday will resolve that issue. So good comment. Next question, please.
All right. How do you get more details for tuition charges?
Ooh, that is a great question. So tuition charges are kind of its own beast. How that works is our sister department, Student Fiscal Services, they're in charge of charging tuition to our budgets. I'm not quite sure on I'm not very familiar on the entire process, but it involves the student fiscal database or the student database where all the information for the students is housed. And so I think Li Ching uses that for her JVs. So again, that's going to be a total JV process. And then also, I believe they have it blocked where you may not be able to do a transfer. I mean, you might at first in my FD, but then the next month you'll see something reversing it. That's because SFS uses the database to reconcile the JVs that are posting to the budget, and they just have to make sure that's all okay. So the best bet is, if something needs to be corrected or you need more information, you want to go into that student database and then contact SFS, and we can help with that. Again, even though it doesn't come from us, again, one of our sister departments, and we understand that's a challenge. So, all right, any more questions?
Well, just like a follow-up to that one, Cindy provided an email for Student Fiscal Services in the chat, fssaid@uw, so thank you. And then one other question, it's actually a budget setup question. Why do we see adding funds to a grant or RRF grant in unallocated? Do we need to track down the PI to get approval for rebudgeting?
That's a great question. So RRF is managed by our friends over in the budget office. And so they have their own way of processing it. Like we process the request to create the budget or sub-budget, I should say, and get that set up so you guys can use it and they can monitor it. And God, is it FOP 07, 11? One of those codes.
11.
It's
Yes.
11.
Thank you guys. So that's going to be a JV. So automatically when it's that object code, you're going to notice that a lot of the time it takes a couple days for the budget to show up. Again, because it's a JV process, and then it's all going to go into 38. We can, after the JV post, we can go back and fix that allocation. We just need to make sure with the budget office that that's okay with them, and it usually is. I mean, I just processed one the other day for those guys. So initially, it's going to come in under 38. A lot of the time, the budget information is attached to the funding actions. So the fine folks at our budget setup team will distribute that for you. But if it wasn't like that to begin with, we can distribute it later. And I don't know if you necessarily need PI approval. I think it's more that it's the budget that you submitted for your RRF project to the budget office, it has to align with that because that's what they're using to reconcile your final report and your expenditures when they review the project at the end. So hopefully I answered all of that.
For RRF specifically, we do go back and revise it to the budget that's on the FA, but like Azalea said, that takes a couple days because first we have to wait for that JV to post, which then goes into 38, and then we'll revise, which then also takes another few days to flow through. So that one can take up to a week or so before it gets allocated.
But also feel free, if you notice that we haven't allocated it and you sent a budget with the funding action, let us know. Because again, right now our workload is high and we just might be a little behind. So always great to hear feedback from campus about that kind of stuff so we can make sure that the budget is useful for you.
All right, one more question. When do you need approvals for rebudgeting?
Ooh, that is a very good question. Okay, so RRFs are internal, but for your sponsored budgets, you want to, when you get your award, when you first get your award, so, you know, Patrick was talking about like, you know, we'll set up the award, you'll get a notification. You want to take a look at all the attachments attached to your funding action when you're doing the review to make sure that we set it up correctly, because that's the same process that we're going to use when you ask us if you can rebudget. So usually sponsors will provide all that information, or it's actually on their website or the RFP. It's going to tell you what their rebudgeting process is. Some sponsors will just give you like a threshold, like 25%. It's like, you know, go ahead, we're not going to question you. But if it's over 25%, they're going to ask you to submit something to them for approval. And the reason for that is usually when something is over 25%, that is a red flag that we're possibly changing the scope of work. And so the sponsor just wants to be reassured that that's not the case. You know, I mean, it's hard because when you're doing a proposal and you're doing a budget, it's your best estimate. And you're not going to know until you get that budget set up and you are ready to rock and roll on your award and start spending. And so, again, that's when a lot of that rebudgeting approval comes up. And so again, it's going to be in the award documents. It's going to be in on the sponsor website. And, you know, you can also ask us for help. We're happy to be that second set of eyes and help you interpret the prior, you know, bring in Matt from post-award fiscal compliance. But ultimately, if the sponsor needs approval, you know, we need to follow that process because we want to protect you to make sure that, you know, you don't get caught by surprise. You know, we submit an invoice, we submit a report, and then we find out later that something needed prior approval and they're not willing to pay for it. And so it's a pain. I know, like sometimes it's just like, oh, I'd always have to ask for approval for everything, but it's better to cover your bases and just make sure that you have everything in writing, everything's good to go, and everything is above board and approved by the sponsor. All right, any more questions?
Nope, no more questions.
All right, thank you guys.
All right, so I'll try to wrap us up here with some smooth award closeout. Next slide. So GIM 39 is our university's policy providing guidance on the closeout of sponsored programs. So those are the budgets that are managed by GCA. When we set up a budget, a final action date is calculated and assigned. This date is automatically calculated based on the earliest final financial document due, and this date cannot be changed. The only way this date can be changed is if there is an extension to a due date, like for a financial report or final invoice, or if neither of those are due for the award, if the end date is changed. So the final action date is the last date that your department can make changes to the budget. After this date, the budget closes to status 3 and it's in the hands of GCA. There are several things to consider before GCA closes the budget. Has the final invoice or report been sent? Is cost share met? Have all payments been received from the sponsor and applied to the budget? Is there a balance, like a surplus or a deficit that needs to be dealt with? And per GIM 39, budgets must be closed to status 4 within 120 days of the award end date. So we need to address these questions before then. Next slide. So at budget setup, GCA enters the due dates for the final documents that we are responsible for into the financial system. These are typically final invoices or final reports. As I mentioned earlier, these are the due dates for these are what drive the final action date. And by establishing a final action date, it gives us some buffer time to make sure that we can complete what we're required to complete, like those invoices or reports, after expenditures are final, but before the sponsor's deadline. It's important to be aware of the final action date and notify GCA before this date if there are any issues with the budget or for some reason expenditures will not be final at that date. If we've not been notified, it should be assumed that we are proceeding with the standard closeout process. So you don't want to be making any additional changes like transferring charges on or off the award. And then if the budget doesn't appear to have any issues, we will just automatically proceed with closeout after the final action date. So that's why it's important that if you do know of any issues that you notify GCA as soon as possible. If the budget needs to be reopened after the final action date, an audit justification must be provided and GCA manager approval is required. Lately, we've been noticing an increase in really late charges, and we've been tracking the requests for reopening a budget due to late posting charges. We track these by department and by requester, since it's an indicator of poor award management. If we're notified of a late charge, it must be posted within 30 days. If this is not possible, your department will need to request an extension from the sponsor. We can't continue to keep budgets open, far beyond the final action date like we may have in the past. Next slide. So cost share requirements need to be satisfied before the budget is closed. It's recommended that non-faculty effort or non-FEC cost share be reconciled and reported to GCA quarterly. Faculty effort certification or FEC cost share should be certified to meet the deadline set forth by the Management Accounting and Analysis Group or MAA. If you have FEC cost share that will not be certified prior to the final action date, you'll need to request an interim cost share report from MAA so we can include the projected amount on our final report or invoice. And then there's a link on this slide here to that, how to make that request. So once these slides are posted, you'll be able to use that link if you need to. And we do not submit final invoices or reports if the cost share appears to be unmet. Next slide. So for the invoices that are generated by GCA, we are able to track receivables and follow up with the sponsor if invoices remain unpaid, but we can't close the budget until all payments are received. For form of payment 11 budgets, those are the ones that are invoiced by your department. And so these are the ones where the award and revenue balances increase as payments are applied. So please make sure that all payments are reconciled and applied to the form of payment 11 budgets prior to the final action date. These budgets must be in status 1 for payments to be applied. So there's just more of a process, to reopen those if late payments are received. So if you do expect additional sponsor payments and the final action date is coming up, please let us know so we can keep the budget open for those to be applied. Next slide. So if your budget has a deficit, it will need to be moved to an allowable budget. And you can request this in Grant Tracker by using the deficit transfer tool. So I have a little picture of what that would look like here. But if you have a sub-budget deficit, or if you have a deficit that you would like to transfer to multiple receiving budgets, the tool does not work. So you'll need to send a request to GCA to process that deficit transfer, and we'll need to do it manually. And we reach out to your department at closeout if there's still a deficit balance. If there are no email contacts listed on the budget and Grant Tracker, we might not be able to reach your department. And so any unresolved deficits will get sent to the Office of Planning and Budgeting, which is also known as OPB, and they'll take care of it within 30 days. So please make sure that you review and update your email contacts in Grant Tracker for your budget so that we don't have to report any deficits to OPP. Next slide. So if there's a surplus on the budget that the UW is allowed to retain, it will be transferred to a departmental fixed surplus budget with the closest F&A rate to the closing grant budget. And we'll send you a notification confirming the budget number, I believe, and letting you know we'll be transferring it. But if you don't have a fixed price surplus account within 10% of the closing grants F&A rate and your surplus balance is over $1,000, you'll need to request a new one. And then lastly, if the sponsor requires us to return unspent funds, or if there was an overbilling on a cost reimbursable contract, like maybe we issued an invoice and then your department transfers some charges off, we'll just automatically proceed with refunding the sponsor. Next slide. So to sum up the closeout process, once the final financial documents have been submitted to the sponsor, the budget is in balance, and any other outstanding issues have been resolved, GCA will close the budget to status 4. Next slide. Any questions?
There's one question. Can we recover from OPB?
And I might pop in on this one. The answer is no. We double checked. But OPB will reach out before they're not going to just do it. They do reach out to the department. And if they don't get it resolved in 30 days, they'll take care of it. And it is considered final at that time.
What's OPB? OPB is the Office of Planning and Budgeting. And thanks for answering that one, Cheryl.
And I don't see any other questions.
Okay, on that note, thank you for coming out and virtually visiting our forum. Our next forum will be in February of 2022 via Zoom. You can keep track of when the exact date and information will be from our website. We will be sending out a survey about this forum soon, the next day or two. So we ask you to complete that and let us know how we're doing. And you can contact us at any time via Grant Tracker, email, GCA Help, or you can call us at our hotline between 9 a.m. and noon and 1 and 4 p.m. on any business day. Thanks again and have a nice afternoon.